Not long ago, we explored a troubling truth Aristotle warned us about. Societies do not usually elevate the most capable among them. They elevate the ones who play the role convincingly, the ones who feel familiar, the ones who make the crowd feel safe. That is why, again and again, fools find their way into positions of power, while the truly brilliant remain overlooked. But if that is true, another question immediately follows. If fools so often rule, why does humanity still progress? Why are we not trapped in endless decline? Why, despite unqualified leaders, shallow culture, and incompetent figures at the top, do we continue to see breakthroughs in science, technology, art, and human freedom? Think about the contradiction. In companies, it is often the smooth talker, not the real expert, who becomes the manager. In communities, the loudest person leads, not the wisest. On the world stage, politicians who can barely string together a thought still manage to steer nations. If this is how power is distributed, we should expect stagnation. We should expect civilizations to collapse under the weight of their own bad choices. And yet, that is not what we see. Look around. We live longer than ever before. We have access to knowledge that once took lifetimes to gather. We carry technology in our pockets that outstrips the wildest dreams of past generations. Even under the leadership of fools, humanity keeps moving forward. This is the paradox. If those at the top are often unqualified, how can progress continue? If leadership is so frequently shallow, why does history not grind to a halt? Either we have misunderstood where progress really comes from, or there is a hidden mechanism we have never noticed. A force that turns even incompetence and failure into fuel for advancement. That is the mystery we are going to uncover. Not whether fools rule, we already know, they often do, but how progress survives and even thrives in spite of them. And once you see this mechanism at work, you will never look at history, or at the present moment, the same way again. If you still hold on to the belief that progress comes from wise leadership, history is going to disappoint you, because the record is merciless. Again and again, the men who shaped eras were not the most competent or the most virtuous. They were simply the most visible, the most familiar, the ones who managed to project confidence while others did the real work. Think about the so-called great kings and emperors. For every ruler celebrated as a genius, you find entire dynasties filled with mediocrity. The Roman Empire endured centuries under leaders who were reckless, vain, or outright incompetent. Yet during that same time, architecture advanced, roads were built, trade expanded, philosophy thrived. Clearly, the survival and growth of civilization did not depend on the personal wisdom of whoever happened to wear the crown. The same is true in business. We like to imagine visionary CEOs guiding companies to greatness, but most of the time the person at the top is a face, a negotiator, a performer. The real engines of innovation are the teams buried deep in the organization. Progress in technology is rarely the product of one leader's genius. It is the result of countless minds working relentlessly, often unnoticed, often ignored by those in charge. So where does this illusion come from? The illusion that leaders create progress. Part of it is comfort. It feels safer to believe someone wise is steering the ship. If things go well, we give them credit. If things go badly, we blame them. Either way, the myth survives, but the truth is harder. Leadership often reflects the lowest common denominator of what the crowd will tolerate, not the highest possibilities of what society could achieve. This is why the great man theory of history is so misleading. It tells us that history is written by exceptional leaders, when in reality it is often written in spite of them. The narrative of the singular genius obscures the deeper mechanisms at work. It blinds us to the fact that fools have ruled countless times, and yet the world kept moving forward. And this is where the real tension lies. If progress is not simply the result of wise leadership, then what is it the result of? If the story of humanity cannot be reduced to great men saving the day, then what hidden process explains the forward motion we continue to see? The answer is unsettling because it suggests that progress is less about brilliance at the top and more about the structures, contradictions, and forces underneath. Forces that operate whether or not the people in charge understand them. Forces that sometimes even use the incompetence of leaders as a trigger for change. In other words, we may need to stop asking whether our leaders are wise enough to carry us forward. We may need to ask a different question altogether. What deeper mechanism keeps humanity moving, even when fools sit on the throne? And once you start asking that question, the old comfort of believing in great men collapses. You begin to see history not as a story of exceptional leaders, but as something stranger, something more paradoxical. Progress survives not because of them, but often in spite of them. So now we face the contradiction head-on. If progress does not depend on great leaders, then how do we explain it? If fools rise to power, if incompetence and vanity often sit at the top, then why does the world not grind to a halt? Think about the last 100 years. We have lived through wars triggered by reckless decisions, economic collapses caused by short-sighted policies, and entire governments paralyzed by corruption. By every measure, these should have derailed civilization. And yet, out of the same chaos came breakthroughs in medicine, the birth of digital technology, the expansion of human rights. Somehow, humanity took steps forward in the very moments when its leaders seemed most lost. Look closer, and the paradox becomes even sharper. The internet was not created by politicians who barely understood computers. It emerged from researchers working quietly in the background, often under governments too distracted to realize the significance of what was being built. Vaccines that saved millions of lives were not invented by heads of state, but by scientists in labs, sometimes fighting for resources from leaders who did not even believe in their work. Progress keeps breaking through, not because those in charge guide it, but because it refuses to be contained by their limitations. And yet, we cannot dismiss leadership entirely. Leaders may not generate progress, but their incompetence shapes the conditions that make progress necessary. A failed policy creates a crisis that forces reform. A reckless war accelerates innovation in technology. A corrupt system provokes resistance and new movements for freedom. Again and again, we see that folly at the top does not prevent advancement. It often provokes it. This realization should unsettle you. It means progress is not a clean story of wisdom triumphing over ignorance. It is a messy process where ignorance itself becomes a strange kind of fuel, where the very failures of leaders create the pressure that drives societies to adapt. So we arrive at the uncomfortable question: if humanity moves forward, even when fools rule, then what exactly is progress? Is it something leaders grant us? Or is it something deeper, something baked into the very structure of history, something that uses even folly and incompetence as raw material? And if that is true, then maybe we have been looking in the wrong place all along. Maybe progress does not live in the wisdom of those at the top, but in a hidden mechanism beneath them, one that turns every failure into momentum. The question is, what is that mechanism? Up to this point, we have been circling around a disturbing truth. Progress does not seem to depend on the intelligence of leaders. It continues even under their incompetence, which forces us into a deeper question. If not them, then what? What invisible engine keeps pushing humanity forward no matter who sits on the throne? This is where the German philosopher Hegel enters the story. Hegel looked at history not as a series of wise men steering the ship, but as something larger, something unfolding through forces even leaders could not control. He believed history was moved by reason itself, not the private reason of individuals, but a kind of universal rationality, what he called the Weltgeist, or world spirit. At first, this sounds abstract, but Hegel had a way of showing how it worked in practice. His key idea was dialectic, the process where contradictions collide, producing conflict, and out of that conflict emerges something higher. A thesis generates its opposite, an antithesis, and through their clash, a new synthesis appears. For Hegel, this was not just an abstract formula, it was the logic of history itself. And here is the shocking part. In Hegel's view, fools, incompetents, and even tyrants were not obstacles to this process. They were instruments of it. He called this the cunning of reason. Reason uses the ambitions, mistakes, and even the stupidity of individuals to achieve goals far beyond their understanding. A leader may pursue vanity, but in doing so he unleashes changes he never intended. A nation may stumble into war, but in the aftermath, institutions and technologies arise that alter the course of humanity. The very folly of individuals becomes the raw material through which reason advances. Take war, for example. No one can deny the destruction it brings. But Hegel pointed out that war also forces societies to reorganize, to strengthen, to invent. The Napoleonic Wars devastated Europe, but they also spread modern legal codes, challenged feudal systems, and accelerated the rise of new nations. Napoleon himself may have believed he was simply chasing personal glory, but in the long arc of history, he became an instrument for reshaping Europe. Reason used him and discarded him when his role was complete. Or consider the world of business. A foolish CEO may run a company into crisis. At first glance, this looks like pure decline. But the crisis forces restructuring. It demands innovation. It clears away complacency and makes space for new leadership, new ideas, new strategies. Time and again, we see companies emerge from failure leaner, sharper, more resilient. The incompetence of one leader triggers the conditions for transformation. The same mechanism appears in culture. An oppressive regime tries to silence its artists, its thinkers, its dissidents. On the surface, this looks like stagnation, but repression breeds resistance. Censorship provokes creativity in hidden forms. The very attempt to suppress thought ends up intensifying it, until eventually the cultural energy bursts out stronger than before. History is full of moments when foolish attempts to control human expression only multiplied its force. This is the cunning of reason. Humanity advances not because leaders are wise, but because their foolishness, their vanity, even their cruelty, creates the very contradictions that drive progress forward. Their failures are the spark that ignites transformation. Their mistakes generate the pressure that forces society to evolve. And here is the most unsettling part. In this view, fools are not an accident of history. They are part of its design. They play their role just as much as the geniuses, the inventors, the visionaries. Without them, the dialectic would stall. Without their blunders, there would be no crises to overcome, no contradictions to resolve, no new forms to emerge. In a strange way, the presence of incompetence is what keeps the mechanism of progress alive. Think about that the next time you see a leader make a disastrous decision, or watch someone unqualified rise to power. It feels like decline. It feels like proof that humanity is doomed. But through Hegel's lens, what you are witnessing is something else. You are watching reason use folly as a tool. You are seeing history create the conditions for its next transformation. Progress, then, is not the triumph of wisdom over ignorance. It is the strange alchemy that turns ignorance itself into a stepping stone. It is the cunning of reason, weaving even the failures of fools into the fabric of human advancement. And once you see this, the paradox begins to make sense. Humanity moves forward not in spite of fools, and not because of them, but through them. Their mistakes are not dead ends. They are part of the path. Hegel gave us the broad frame. History does not wait for wise men. It moves through contradiction, using even fools as fuel. But to make this concrete, we need to look at the mechanisms that turn folly into forward motion. because it is not enough to say reason uses mistakes. We need to understand how. The first mechanism is what the Italian thinker Vilfredo Pareto called the circulation of elites. Power never stays in one set of hands forever. When incompetent leaders rise, they eventually create conditions that expose their weakness. The result is turnover. Old elites are replaced by new ones, sometimes slowly, sometimes through sudden upheaval. This circulation prevents total stagnation. Even if fools dominate for a time, their very failures clear the path for more capable forces to enter. In other words, incompetence triggers its own replacement. The second mechanism is hidden inside the structure of power itself. Leaders may appear to hold absolute authority, but real power is often distributed across networks of expertise, what we might call the technocratic layer. Governments rely on bureaucracies, companies rely on engineers, accountants, designers. Societies rely on countless specialists whose work continues regardless of who claims the title of leader. The public face may be a fool, but the machinery underneath is run by competence. Progress seeps through the cracks of authority, carried by those who do the real work, while others pose for the spotlight. The third mechanism is decentralization. Progress rarely depends on one node. Scientific revolutions, artistic movements, technological shifts, they emerge from scattered individuals, small groups, experiments carried out at the edges. A foolish king cannot stop mathematicians from discovering geometry. A clueless politician cannot halt the spread of an idea once it has taken root. Authority can slow things down, but it cannot choke off the sheer diversity of human creativity. The future leaks in through countless channels, bypassing the ignorance of leaders. The fourth mechanism is psychological. Failure and crisis create pressure in the collective mind. Freud described how unconscious drives seek release, and Durkheim showed how social breakdowns produce new forms of solidarity. When leaders blunder, they unleash frustration, disillusionment, and even despair. But these emotional shocks do not simply destroy. They reorganize. They force societies to re-examine values, to forge new identities, to demand new structures. The pain of incompetence becomes the catalyst for transformation at the deepest level of culture. Seen together, these mechanisms explain why progress persists. The circulation of elites ensures no ruling class lasts forever. The hidden layer of competence keeps essential systems functioning. Decentralization spreads innovation beyond the reach of fools, and psychological pressure turns collective suffering into the raw material of renewal. This is why history feels paradoxical. From the surface, it looks like leaders determine everything, but underneath, a larger machinery is at work. A machinery that not only survives incompetence, but sometimes requires it. Fools trigger the very processes that eventually push them aside. Their failures create the tension that forces progress to erupt elsewhere. It is tempting to cling to the fantasy that if only the right people held power, everything would run smoothly. But history whispers a darker truth. Progress does not wait for perfection at the top. It emerges from the cracks, from the pressure, from the unintended consequences of folly. And this brings us back to Hegel's insight. The cunning of reason is not just a philosophical idea. It is woven into the very structure of society, psychology, and culture. Progress survives because mechanisms exist to transform failure into movement. Leaders may be fools, but they are never the whole story. The world keeps moving because deeper forces will not allow it to stop. Now we can finally see what has been hidden all along. Humanity does not progress because leaders are wise. It progresses because the system itself turns even their folly into fuel. The illusion of great leadership crumbles once you recognize that the true engine of history lies deeper in mechanisms that do not depend on intelligence at the top. This flips the story we like to tell ourselves. We imagine wisdom steering civilization forward, but in reality, incompetence often provides the spark. A bad law provokes reform. A disastrous war accelerates technology. A corrupt government awakens resistance. Fools in power are not simply obstacles to progress. They are part of the machinery that keeps it alive. Take politics. Incompetent rulers have often triggered the very movements that swept them away. Monarchs who clung to privilege too long sparked revolutions that reshaped nations. Leaders who underestimated their people accidentally created demands for democracy, equality, and freedom. Their stupidity did not stop history, it forced it forward. Or look at economics. When CEOs make reckless choices, companies collapse. But collapse is not the end. Competitors step in, new firms emerge, industries reinvent themselves. The failure of one leader clears the stage for the next wave of innovation. What looks like decline from the inside often becomes renewal when viewed from the outside. Even in culture, the same law holds. Attempts to silence ideas only make them stronger. Artists censored by foolish regimes become symbols of resistance. Thinkers ignored by shallow elites often plant seeds that flourish later. The very effort to control culture ends up intensifying it until what was hidden bursts into the open. This is the uncomfortable truth. Progress is not the triumph of wisdom over ignorance. It is the transformation of ignorance itself into a stepping stone. Fools in power are not accidents to be erased from the story. They are part of the process. They trigger the contradictions, the crises, the pressures that make progress necessary. So when you look at history and wonder how humanity advanced under leaders who seemed determined to hold it back, the answer is clear. It advanced not because of them, but through them. Their failures were not detours. They were the path itself. So what does this mean for us, here and now? It means we must let go of the comfortable illusion that history will be saved by the right leader, the wise ruler, the genius CEO. That fantasy is seductive because it allows us to wait. It allows us to believe that progress will arrive when someone smarter finally takes the throne. But history tells a harsher truth. Progress does not depend on whether fools or sages hold power. It depends on the deeper mechanisms that turn even failure into movement, which means we cannot sit back and hope for wisdom to rescue us. We are part of the process. We are the ones carrying progress forward, often in ways invisible to the very people who claim to lead. This should change how you see the world. The incompetence you witness at the top is not the end of the story. It is the pressure that shapes what comes next. The crises it produces are not dead ends. They are raw material. And the question you must ask yourself is not whether leaders will finally be smart enough. The question is, what role will you play when the system begins to transform? Will you be one of those who merely endure, waiting for change to arrive? Or will you be part of the force that channels failure into renewal? Because if fools are the fuel of history, then those who see the mechanism clearly are the ones who can steer their own lives through it. They are the ones who find freedom, not by waiting for the wise, but by recognizing that progress is already moving with or without them. And that is the final paradox. The presence of fools in power may be inevitable, but so is the forward motion of humanity. Once you see this, you stop looking up for salvation. You start looking around at the hidden forces, the small movements, the countless sparks of progress already at work. That is where history is made, and that is where your freedom begins.